November 12, 1970, East Pakistan, midnight. 500,000 people disappear in a single night. It was not a sudden tectonic shift. It was not a massive volcanic blast, and it was not a disaster that arrived without warning. Instead, a series of vague warnings and a 33-foot wall of water turned a quiet, moonless delta into a massive watery tomb. How did a systems failure allow a standard storm to bypass every warning and drown 500,000 lives in their sleep? To understand the scale of the disaster, we must first examine the geography. The Bay of Bengal is not just a body of water, it is a giant funnel. This funnel stretches over 300 miles or 500 kilometers from the open ocean of the south, narrowing drastically to a mere 60 miles or 100 kilometers at its northern tip. Along this northern coast, the continental shelf is shallow. The water depth averages less than 30 feet or 10 meters for miles offshore. A ship sailing 50 miles out would still find itself in water shallow enough to see the seafloor on a clear day. When a storm pushes northward, the funnel effect compresses the ocean, forcing massive volumes of water into the narrow bay. The shallow seafloor prevents this water from escaping underneath. Instead, it rises. Physicists call this storm surge. It is a slow, unstoppable rise. The geography of the bay acts like a liquid piston ready to strike the low-lying coast. This funnel is a geographic trap. Any increase in ocean volume has nowhere to go but up and onto the land. In November 1970, this trap was set. A Category 3 cyclone was moving toward the coast, carrying winds of 115 miles per hour, or 185 kilometers per hour. To the meteorological offices, it was a standard storm, but they failed to calculate the shape of the bay. The physics of the funnel were already at work, silent and invisible. For centuries, the tides here had been predictable. They rose and fell with the moon. But geography does not change, and the bay was waiting for the right catalyst. A low-pressure system was all it took to turn this calm delta into a chaotic hydraulic press. At the throat of this funnel lies Manpura Island. Manpura is a flat strip of land, a flat emerald plate floating on a gray sea. It rises less than 10 feet or 3 meters above the average sea level. In 1970, more than 22,000 people lived here. They were fishermen and rice farmers' families who had cultivated this silt for generations. The island was lush and fertile. The air smelled of mud, salt, and drying fish. Every morning the sun rose over green palms, and the sound of children playing filled the villages. The ocean was their provider. It gave them food, transport, and life. They had survived storms before. They knew the winds could tear the thatched roofs and flood the low fields. But they did not know that their home was a geographic trap. The shallow waters around them, which made fishing so abundant, were the very reason they were vulnerable. In the quiet delta, no one built brick homes. They lived in houses of bamboo and mud tied together with jute. These structures were built to withstand rain, not ocean surges. They went to sleep on the night of November 12th listening to the familiar patter of rain. They believed the earth beneath them was solid. They believed they were safe, but the water was already rising. The ocean was about to reclaim the land. Warnings are only as useful as the systems that carry them. Along the coast of East Pakistan, the Chittagong radar station was the only shield against the sea. But in the autumn of 1970, this shield was broken. A critical component in the radar had failed, leaving the screen cluttered with static. The technicians on duty knew the danger. They sent urgent, repeated requests to the central military government in Islamabad, demanding funds for replacement parts. The response was silence. The bureaucracy at Islamabad did not view East Pakistan as a priority. While the paperwork sat on desks 1,000 miles away, the cyclone gathered strength, its winds intensifying to 115 miles per hour, or 185 kilometers per hour. The Chittagong radar remained blind. It was a failure of steel and wire, but more than that, it was a failure of the state. The warning was not delivered because the warning was not funded. The system had already chosen to look away. On the island of Manpura, the air pressure began to drop. The sky turned a dark copper color. The birds went silent, and the wind began to hiss through the palm trees. Without the Chittagong radar, the meteorologists in Dhaka had no precise coordinate. They knew a storm was out there in the Bay of Bengal, but they did not know its path. They did not know its speed. They were drawing lines on maps using guesswork, hoping the storm would turn away. It did not. When the warning was broadcast, it was not an alarm. It was an anesthetic. On the evening of November 12, 1970, the Hawaii Meteorological Center warned that a massive storm surge was building. In the Bay of Bengal, Indian Weather Services sent urgent warnings of a high surge, but the government radio station in Dhaka did not broadcast these warnings. Instead, they announced a storm warning of Level 4. Level 4 was a code for a minor storm, one that advised boats to stay at harbor, but assured villagers that their homes were safe. There was no mention of a 33-foot wall of water. The government of West Pakistan, which controlled the Dhaka radio station, chose to downplay the threat to avoid public panic and the cost of evacuation. The local warning systems, including the simple handheld megaphones in the villages, remained unused. No warning flag was raised. No sirens were sounded on the low islands. In the government offices, official notes recorded that every precaution had been taken and that everything is under control. But it was not. The Level 4 warning meant the villagers did not flee to the higher ground of the mainland. They stayed in their houses of bamboo and mud. They closed their doors against the wind, believing they had been told the whole truth. They did not know the radio Dhaka was broadcasting safety while a monster wave was racing toward their shores. They trusted the system. That trust would be fatal. No boats were sent to evacuate the outermost islands. No warning flags were raised on the beaches. They went to sleep as if it were a normal rainstorm. A tropical cyclone is a low-pressure heat engine. In the second week of November 1970, this engine reached its peak efficiency. The central pressure of the storm fell to 966 millibars. The wind velocity held constant at 115 miles per hour, or 185 kilometers per hour. As this rotating mass of air approached the coast, its physical force interacted with two external factors. The first was astronomical. The moon and the sun were aligned, creating the maximum gravitational pull on the ocean. This alignment produced the astronomical high tide. The normal high tide was already 4 feet or over 1 meter higher than average. The second factor was the shape of the bay. The shallow continental shelf acted as a friction block. As the storm wind pushed the water northward, the shallow seafloor prevented the water from returning southward at depth. The water had no escape route. The 300-mile funnel of the Bay of Bengal compressed the rising water. The physical system converted the wind energy into water height. The surge was no longer a wave. It was a solid block of ocean moving forward. The physics of the storm surge were relentless. Water weighs 64 pounds per cubic foot, or 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. When this mass is set in motion at 15 miles per hour, or 24 kilometers per hour, no earthen structure can resist it. Along the coast of East Pakistan, the defense system consisted of simple mud walls or embankments built to protect crops from normal high tides. They were 6 feet or less than 2 meters high. The water did not simply flow over them. The pressure of the rising tide saturated the loose dirt. The water chewed the foundations of the embankments, liquefying the soil. Within minutes, the barriers dissolved, and the ocean entered the low-lying plains. Midnight, November 12, 1970. The moon was absent, leaving the delta in complete darkness. On Manpura Island, the first sign of the wave was not visual. It was auditory. A low-frequency hum grew into a roar, a noise that survivors compared to the sound of multiple steam locomotives or armored trains operating at maximum throttle. The air carried a thick, metallic smell of churned mud and decaying organic matter. Then came the wind. The gusts snapped mature coconut palms, throwing the heavy fronds through the dark air like projectiles. And then the ocean arrived. A wall of water measuring 33 feet or 10 meters high struck the island. This surge was not a temporary wave that retreated. It was a sudden, permanent rise in the sea level. The volume of water that surged over the 11 square mile or 28 square kilometer island in less than 10 minutes was equivalent to 160,000 Olympic swimming pools. It carried millions of tons of salt water, silt, and debris. The pressure crushed the bamboo and mud houses instantly. The families inside were swept into the current. The water level rose above the height of the trees. While the ocean reclaimed the land, the radio station in Dhaka was silent, its transmitters turned off for the scheduled night maintenance. The official logs in the government offices still carried the last broadcast status, everything is under control. But on the coast, the water was supreme. The surge traveled 15 miles, or 24 kilometers inland, stripping the soil bare. By 2 o'clock in the morning, 70 coastal islands had disappeared beneath the tide. The survivors were those who were carried by the water into the upper branches of trees, or those who managed to hold onto floating thatch. The rest were submerged in the cold, fast-moving water. Survival in a storm surge is often a matter of structural engineering or pure chance. Muhammad Abdul Hai, an 18-year-old resident of Manpura Island, survived because of a building. His father, a local merchant, had constructed a rare two-story brick house near the center of the village. This structure served as an ironic shelter. When the water hit, Muhammad Hai climbed to the concrete roof of the second floor, but his parents and younger siblings, who were sleeping on the ground floor, were trapped. The water filled the first story within 60 seconds. The brick walls held, but the space inside became a water chamber. Muhammad Hai could hear the muffled cries through the concrete floor beneath his feet, but the pressure of the tide made it impossible to open the doors. He stood on the roof alone, listening to his family drown below him. Around the island, others survived by climbing the trunks of wild coconut palms. The wind bent the trees at 45-degree angles, and the salt spray was so thick it was impossible to breathe without cupping a hand over the mouth. For 6 hours, the survivors clung to the rough bark. The violent motion of the storm rubbed their chests, arms, and thighs against the trees, scraping away layers of skin. When the salt water hit the open wounds, the pain was intense. This specific pattern of physical trauma, deep infected abrasions on the front of the body, became known to local medical workers as the cyclone syndrome. The screams of those losing their grip were lost in the roar of the wind. They fell into the darkness, their bodies swept into the bay, leaving only a few hundred people clinging to the treetops, waiting for the morning light. When the sun rose on November 13th, the water retreated, but the world had ended. Between 300,000 and 500,000 people had been killed in a single night. The geography of the delta was unrecognizable. Manpura Island, all 11 square miles, or 28 square kilometers of it, was entirely stripped of its vegetation and structures. It was reduced to a flat expanse of gray, viscous mud. As the heat of the morning intensified, the physical reality of the aftermath became fully apparent. A dense odor of decomposing organic matter and rotting marine life filled the thick air. The only sound was the harsh cries of crows circling over the defoliated trees. For the survivors, the cold, wet mud clung to their bare feet as they wandered aimlessly, searching the debris for the bodies of their families. The systemic collapse extended beyond the immediate loss of life. The region's economic foundation was erased. More than 60% of the coastal fishing capacity, boats, nets, and infrastructure had been swept out to sea. Entire herds of agricultural livestock drowned in the fields. The salt water from the surge had contaminated the freshwater wells, rendering them toxic. With no clean water to drink, cholera began to spread rapidly among the stranded survivors. They had survived the immediate physics of the storm, only to face the prolonged struggle of a destroyed ecosystem. The scale of the destruction required an immediate, massive mobilization of national resources. The survivors looked to the sky, waiting for the arrival of military helicopters and supply drops. But the sky remained empty. They were isolated on a dead island, trapped in a disaster zone where the natural systems had failed them, and the political systems were about to do the same. Chowdhury Kamal, a local council member of Manpura Island, stood among the ruins. In the days following the cyclone, his testimony would reach the international press through the Guardian newspaper. He described the aftermath with forensic clarity. There are no houses left. We are living under the trees. The dead are everywhere, and we have no spade to bury them. For 3 consecutive days, no rescue helicopters arrived. No supply ships appeared on the horizon. The military government of West Pakistan did not initiate an immediate relief operation. Left completely abandoned, Kamal and the remaining able-bodied survivors were forced to handle the crisis themselves. They had to gather thousands of decaying bodies to prevent a widespread outbreak of disease. Without tools, they used their bare hands to dig mass graves in the saturated earth. The sensory reality of this task was grim. The survivors felt the cold, slippery slime of the mud pushing through their bare fingers as they dug. The wet clay coated their faces, mixing with the tears of despair. They were burying their families, their neighbors, and their entire community. Scooping out the earth handful by handful. It is necessary to pause and consider this environment. Imagine standing on an empty mudflat, surrounded by the decomposing bodies of everyone you have ever known. There is no clean water to drink. there are no tools to dig graves, and the sky above remains perfectly clear, devoid of any rescue aircraft. Under these exact conditions, how many hours could you endure before your mind fractured entirely? This was not an abstract scenario. It was the physical reality for the survivors of Bhola, abandoned by their government in their most desperate hour. The scale of the death toll was not an unavoidable act of nature. It was an act of deliberate political negligence. While 500,000 bodies lay decomposing in the mud, the military government in West Pakistan delayed every significant relief effort. President Yahya Khan flew over the disaster zone in his private aircraft returning from a state visit to China. Yet he did not stop to coordinate emergency operations. As international aid organizations from Britain and the United States mobilized rescue helicopters, the government in Islamabad refused to grant them immediate flight clearance, citing concerns over border security. They prioritized political control over the survival of their own citizens. Meanwhile, a fleet of Pakistani military helicopters sat idle on the tarmac in Karachi, 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers away. When international journalists questioned the delay, pressing officials on the visible starvation and cholera spreading across the islands, the government issued a public statement. They assured the world that relief was moving smoothly and that everything is under control. It was the third time that phrase had been used. First to excuse a broken radar, second to silence the storm warning, and finally to cover up the systemic abandonment of the survivors. The phrase was no longer an assurance, it was an indictment. The cyclone only gathered the water, but the systemic indifference of West Pakistan pulled the trigger that drowned 500,000 people. The tragedy was not simply a failure of meteorology or infrastructure. It was the deliberate refusal of a ruling class to view the people of East Pakistan as human beings worthy of rescue. The physical storm dissipated over the mainland, but the political storm had just begun. The calculated indifference of the central government ignited a fire in East Pakistan. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, a local political leader, declared that the failure to provide relief was absolute proof that East Pakistan must govern itself. He argued that the dead of Bhola were not victims of a natural disaster, but martyrs of an oppressive regime. This realization swept through the population faster than the storm surge. The tragedy led directly to a landslide victory for the Awami League in the national elections held the following month in December 1970. It set in motion the Liberation War of 1971, ultimately forging the independent nation of Bangladesh. The Bhola Cyclone remains the deadliest storm in recorded history, not because the wind was too strong or the water too deep, but because the system designed to protect the people chose to let them drown. It washed away the legitimacy of an entire government, proving that a state built on the devaluation of its citizens cannot survive its own apathy. Reconstructing a historical disaster of this scale, especially the human and systemic failures that followed, requires weeks of deep archival research. If you believe these forgotten lessons of history need to be preserved, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. Thank you for your support.